At first light on October the 9th, 1942, the jungle west of the Matanikau River sounded like it always did on Guadalcanal wet leaves. Insects, distant surf. Then it went wrong. A Marine point man froze, crouched behind a rotting log, and stared through a gap in the brush at a line of Japanese soldiers moving low and quiet along the ridgeline. Not running, not charging, sliding forward like they owned the ground. The Marines around Henderson Field were already stretched thin. Their western flank was exposed, and the Matanikau was the one place a disciplined enemy regiment could pry open and roll the whole perimeter back toward the airfield. If that seam broke, everything the Americans had bled for since August could unravel in a single week. What happened next became one of those battlefield numbers that sounded exaggerated until you read the reports. Marine accounts later credited roughly 700 to 750 Japanese dead in 4 days along the Matanikau, most of it tied to one crazy decision made by a Marine colonel who wasn't even supposed to be running a fight like this. Colonel William Wild Bill Whaling wasn't a celebrity. He wasn't a Hollywood hero. He was a staff officer on Guadalcanal, a former competitive marksman, a hard man with a reputation for being sharp and difficult. He was the kind of officer other officers labeled a problem, especially after he was relieved of a line command. But Whaling didn't leave the island. He asked to stay. Then he asked for something that sounded like a waste of combat power. He wanted to strip the best shots and best woodsmen out of regular units, men who could move without snapping branches, who could read boot prints in mud, who could sit still for hours with ants crawling up their sleeves and train them as hunters. Not as parade ground riflemen, hunters. Then he wanted to bolt that group onto a rifle battalion and push them out in front as a roaming scout sniper spearhead. To a lot of Marines, it sounded backward. Why pull good riflemen out of the companies that needed every trigger? Why concentrate them into a small detachment that might get cut off and wiped out? Guadalcanal wasn't a place for experiments. It was a place where malaria, hunger, and artillery punished every mistake. But on that October morning, the experiment was already in the brush ahead of the line. Whaling's hand-picked scouts lay in pairs, not talking, not moving, working a simple problem with lethal discipline: find the Japanese unit's nervous system, then cut it. Officers, NCOs, observers, machine gun crews, men whose voices and hand signals kept the column coherent. The point man watched the Japanese file past at close range, close enough to see the sweat on their backs and the darkened cloth around their rifles. One careless shot would bring the whole column down on them. One clean shot, at the right man, could make the enemy column hesitate. Hesitation was all the Marines needed to bend the fight into an ambush instead of a frontal slog. Whaling wasn't trying to win Guadalcanal with a trick rifle or a new gadget. He was trying to win it by reorganizing human talent into a weapon, turning a handful of quiet, disciplined shooters into a force that could collapse a regiment from the inside out. And the question hanging over that ridgeline in the first minutes of dawn was simple. If this scout sniper plan really worked, how did it produce a number as brutal as 750 in just 4 days without the Marines losing the flank? And without Whaling's little hunter force getting erased in the jungle, if you want to see how Whaling's off-book experiment actually played out in the killing ground west of the Matanikau, hit like and subscribe. Every bit of support tells YouTube these overlooked World War II decisions still matter, and it helps us keep bringing the next story back to life. Now, back to the man who wasn't supposed to be in command anymore, standing on Guadalcanal, asking for one chance to prove that crazy could be practical. William J. Wild Bill Whaling wasn't the kind of officer who blended in. He'd built his reputation the hard way through marksmanship, discipline, and an almost stubborn insistence on doing things the way the terrain demanded, not the way the manual preferred. In a peacetime Marine Corps, that could make you valuable. In a war fought inside a jungle, It could make you dangerous. By the time Guadalcanal turned into a grinding fight for Henderson Field, Whaling was serving as an officer on the 1st Marine Division staff, close enough to see every patrol report, every casualty list, every pattern in the Japanese defenses. He wasn't just hearing rumors. He was reading the numbers where men were dying, how they were being pinned, and how often small Japanese groups were stalling larger Marine movements simply by owning the trees, the ridgelines, and the first few hundred yards of visibility. Whaling also carried a chip that mattered. He'd been pushed out of a line command role marked, in some eyes, as a difficult personality. On most islands, that would have been the end of his influence. On Guadalcanal, it became fuel. Instead of leaving, he asked to stay. And he came with a proposal that treated marksmanship and fieldcraft as something you could concentrate, weaponize, and drive forward like a blade ahead of the battalion. By early October 1942, Guadalcanal wasn't a campaign anymore. It was a perimeter. Everything the Americans cared about on that island: food, ammunition, wounded men. The ability to keep fighting at all was tied to one strip of coral and steel Henderson Field. If the airfield stayed in American hands, Japanese ships and troop movements could be hit in daylight. If Henderson fell, the island would be isolated, starved, and eventually crushed. That made the ground around the airfield matter in a way it didn't on a map. The Marines weren't trying to take Guadalcanal in some abstract sense. They were trying to keep a tight ring of jungle, ridges, and river crossings from collapsing inward. On the western side of that ring sat the Matanikau River, a muddy, fast-changing barrier that looked like a defensive line until you walked it. In places it was steep-banked and hard to cross. In others it was shallow enough for a determined enemy to slip through, disappear into the trees, and reappear behind a Marine outpost. The river wasn't a wall, it was a seam, and seams are where an enemy regiment tries to pry. The Japanese on Guadalcanal understood the terrain quickly. They didn't need to outgun the Marines to hurt them. They needed to control visibility. The jungle did that for free. In the thick growth west of the river, engagement ranges weren't measured in fields or hundreds of yards. They were measured in steps, 30 yards, 50, 100 if you were lucky. That meant a small, well-placed machine gun could lock down a trail. A few riflemen in trees could stop a platoon cold. A hidden observer could call fire or guide movement while the Americans argued about where the shots were coming from. This is where the standard way of thinking about infantry combat started to break down. On paper, you push rifle companies forward, keep everyone distributed, maintain a clean chain of command, and win by weight more rifles, more grenades, more momentum. But the jungle punished momentum. The lead elements couldn't see far enough to pick good lanes. Units got separated by vegetation and broken ground. Radios failed, runners got lost, and once a Marine unit was pinned, getting unstuck usually cost blood. The other problem was psychological, and it showed up in the reports. Men weren't just being killed, they were being watched. The Japanese used concealment like a weapon. A shot would crack from somewhere high, and you'd instinctively fire back at leaves. Then you'd have to move again, knowing the next shot might come from the tree you had already walked past. That kind of fighting has a rhythm, and it favors the side that can see first. For the Marines, the cost wasn't limited to the trigger pull. Guadalcanal was already draining them. Malaria and dysentery were constant. Food was thin. Sleep came in scraps. A battalion could have its paper strength and still be brittle because so many men were sick, exhausted, or carrying someone else's load. Every patrol that came back with casualties reduced the perimeter's ability to absorb the next shock. And the shocks kept coming, especially along the Matanikau. The Japanese didn't need to punch straight through to win. They needed to keep the west side unstable, force the Marines into repeated actions along the Matanikau that burned time, ammunition, and experienced leaders. If a Japanese regiment could work through that seam, get onto the ridges, and threaten the approaches toward Henderson Field, the American perimeter would have to bend, and bending under pressure often turns into breaking. So the tactical problem in October wasn't a mystery. It was almost painfully clear. The Marines needed eyes ahead of the line, eyes that could detect movement before it became a close-range ambush. They needed shooters who could remove the few enemy men whose actions controlled everyone else, the machine gun crew leader, the officer with the compass, the observer signaling the next move. If those men were gone. Japanese units didn't stop fighting, but they lost coherence. They hesitated. They bunched up. They argued about direction. And in a jungle where visibility was short and fear traveled fast, hesitation could be lethal. That's the gap Whaling saw from the staff side of the war. Distributed skill was being wasted. Good shots were buried inside rifle squads doing the same exhausting patrol work as everyone else. Meanwhile, Japanese small unit tactics were turning the terrain into an advantage every day. So the question became operational, not philosophical. How do you create a force that can move ahead of the battalion, survive out there, and systematically break the enemy's control points before the main Marine attack ever steps into the killing ground? Whaling's idea wasn't a new rifle. It wasn't a secret map. It was a personnel decision, one that most commanders avoided in a perimeter fight because it looked reckless on paper. He wanted to concentrate talent. Instead of leaving every good shot scattered across dozens of squads, he proposed pulling 100 of the best woodsmen and marksmen out of the line, men who could move quietly, who didn't panic when they were alone in the trees, who could judge distance in broken light, and who could make themselves disappear when the jungle was trying to swallow them anyway. Then he wanted to train them on the island, with the enemy close enough that every lesson was immediately real. The pitch sounded wrong to Marines who were already short on bodies. Every rifle company needed experienced men. Every platoon needed steady hands. And Whaling was essentially asking commanders to give up their best. At the moment, the Japanese were probing the perimeter. If the experiment failed, it wouldn't just fail quietly, it would fail in front of everyone, and it would cost lives. That was the first fight Whaling had to win before anyone fired a shot. He framed it as a simple trade. Give me your best shooters now, and I'll give you fewer ambushes later. Give me men who can hunt, and I'll reduce the number of times your platoons walk into a machine gun they never saw. In a jungle, he argued, the battalion that sees first gets to choose the terms of contact. The battalion that doesn't bleeds for every 50 yards. What made it crazy wasn't only the concept. It was the role. Whaling didn't want these men sitting back, guarding the perimeter like static snipers. He wanted a forward spearhead scouts and shooters working out in front of the battalion, probing trails, finding enemy positions, slipping around flanks, and killing key men before the main body ever arrived. That meant operating in small teams, separated from the comfort of a line, sometimes beyond immediate support, in a place where men already disappeared into the jungle and never came back. Proposing to push small groups even farther forward sounded like volunteering for casualties. So the preparation wasn't glamorous, it was practical, and it was built around survival. First came selection. Whaling wasn't looking for the loudest volunteers. He was looking for the men other Marines described in a certain way: steady, quiet, doesn't get lost, good eyes, good hands. He favored hunters, woodsmen, and men who were already doing the little things right, keeping their gear quiet, moving without talking, noticing broken branches and fresh footprints. Marksmanship mattered, but temperament mattered more. A jittery shooter in the jungle is a liability. A calm shooter is a weapon. Then came the rules. Not parade ground rules, field rules. No unnecessary shots. No firing just because you think someone's there. You don't win by making noise. You win by controlling the first minute of contact. The first shot has to matter. If you miss, you don't get a clean second chance. You get a Japanese unit pouring fire into the tree line while your own Marines try to figure out where you are. Whaling trained them to think in targets, not bodies. A machine gun crew isn't 3 men. It's a system. Kill the gunner, and the assistant takes over. Kill the leader, and the crew hesitates. Kill the man with the binoculars, and the unit loses its eyes. In this kind of fight, you don't have to kill everyone. You have to kill the men who make everyone else effective. He drilled stalking and camouflage because in the Solomons, your silhouette kills you faster than your mistakes. He drilled movement because the jungle doesn't allow clean lines, only angles. He drilled patience because the enemy could sit in one tree for hours. If you couldn't outweight them, you couldn't beat them. And he drilled communication because operating ahead of the battalion meant one critical requirement: information had to flow back. A scout sniper team that kills 2 Japanese and then vanishes is a story. A scout sniper team that marks a machine gun nest, identifies the trail the enemy uses, and signals the battalion where to swing its flank is combat power. The final step was integration. Whaling didn't want a detached band of lone wolves. He wanted his hunter teams welded to a rifle battalion. Moving with a larger plan, their job was to go first, shape the contact, and set conditions so the battalion could hit hard at the right place instead of walking into the wrong place. By the time the October actions along the Matanikau were about to kick off, Whaling's experiment had become a real unit with a real mission and a real risk profile. If they succeeded, they could collapse Japanese positions before the Marines ever paid the usual price. If they failed, they wouldn't just get wiped out. They'd prove every critic right, and they'd leave the battalion blind on the most dangerous flank of the island. Now the only thing left was the test. The first day didn't look like a textbook assault with clean lines and clear objectives. It looked like Guadalcanal always looked when it was about to take blood-wet heat. Crushed ferns, and a battalion trying to move without giving the jungle a chance to ambush it. Whaling's scout sniper teams went out early. Ahead of the riflemen they were welded to, not in a proud skirmish line but in pairs and small knots, spaced out, silent, moving like men who assumed they were already being watched. In that terrain, the math was brutal. At 100 yards you often saw nothing. At 30 yards you might see everything too late. So the scouts worked in the rhythm. Whaling had hammered into them, stop. Listen, observe, move 10 yards, stop again. Every pause forced the enemy to reveal himself by impatience, by a scrape of gear, a breath too loud, the snap of a twig that didn't belong to the wind. They weren't looking for bodies first. They were looking for the signs of bodies: a thin break in undergrowth, a fresh scuff in mud, an unnatural lane where leaves had been kicked and pressed flat. The first real clue came as a quiet, almost invisible trail that hadn't been there the day before. The point man didn't call it out. He signaled back with a hand that barely moved. The team peeled off the obvious route and slid into thicker brush, angling to see the lane without being on it. That was the difference between the old way and Whaling's way. The old way walked into the enemy's geometry. The new way tried to draw the geometry first, then decide how to cut it. They waited until the jungle gave them confirmation. It came as soft voices, controlled breathing, boots that avoided loud contact, Japanese infantry moving with discipline, not stumbling. It wasn't 2 or 3 men drifting through. It was more. And the scouts didn't shoot just because a target existed. They held fire until they could answer the only question that mattered: who makes this group dangerous? Through gaps in green, they picked out shapes that signaled control. One man moving slightly ahead and pausing to look back. Another with binoculars. the telltale burden of a machine gun crew, a weapon case. Ammo. Men who moved like they had a job more important than simply walking. Whaling had taught them to hunt the nervous system, not the muscle. The first shot had to matter. Because in that jungle, you didn't get a clean second chance. You got an angry unit pouring fire into the trees while your own battalion tried to figure out where the contact even was. One scout committed. A single round cracked. Sharp and controlled. The man with binoculars dropped as if his legs had been cut from under him. Almost immediately. From a second position. Another shot took the forward figure, likely an NCO, who collapsed hard and didn't move. The Japanese reaction came in the order well-trained troops often follow when the world suddenly stops making sense. First silence, then low movement, then a frantic attempt to locate what they couldn't see. In thick jungle. Sound bounces and dies. Leaves look like leaves, shadows look like shadows. The unit hesitated, and hesitation was the opening Whaling had promised the battalion. The scout team didn't stay to trade rounds. They shifted 10 yards, 20 using the confusion they had created. From the new angle, one of them saw Japanese hands dragging the machine gun case back off the lane. That meant the enemy wasn't committing forward anymore. They were trying to pull their teeth out of danger before the Marines could bite down. A third shot ended that plan. The man dragging the case went down. The case dropped, and the Japanese column compressed behind a bend in the trail. Bunching in the one-way infantry never wants to bunch. Now they were a formation that could be punished, and the most important part of Whaling's concept clicked into place. Information flowed back fast and clean. Not a vague shots in the trees, not a panicked contact front. A usable report enemy movement on this lane. A machine gun element here. The column bunched. Leadership hit. The battalion adjusted its approach immediately, instead of pushing straight into the lane. It angled to strike from the side. At the moment, the Japanese were still oriented the wrong way, still trying to solve a problem behind them. When the rifle battalion opened up, it wasn't a random exchange. It was timed to enemy uncertainty. Fire hit from a direction they hadn't prepared for, and their return fire came late and scattered. The battalion didn't have to feel for the enemy by sacrificing the lead squad. The enemy had been pinned to a known piece of ground by a few quiet shots and a disciplined report. That pattern repeated across the first phase, and each repetition made the entire operation more efficient. Another team didn't find a Japanese position because they saw men first. They found it because they saw the terrain being used the way a smart defender would use it. A slight rise with a view over a shallow approach. A natural anchor point for a gun that could lock a trail. The scouts circled wide through thicker vegetation, trading speed for invisibility, taking time to earn angles instead of walking into them. They crawled, waited, watched for the giveaway, an unnatural straight edge among natural lines, a faint gleam of metal that didn't belong to bark or leaf. They held until a head and shoulders profile appeared just long enough, and then one clean round erased the confidence of the position. A machine gun nest doesn't stop fighting because one man is hit. It stops when the crew can't see what is killing them and can't measure the threat. In a jungle. Uncertainty is a weapon. A crew that won't expose itself becomes a crew that isn't firing. And that silence is often the difference between a battalion moving and a battalion bleeding in place. Sometimes the scouts chose not to shoot at all. And that restraint was part of why Phase 1 worked. They spotted Japanese soldiers moving across a bend that looked safe but wasn't. It was a funnel. And funnels are opportunities if you have the discipline to let the enemy step into them. The team held fire, watched the movement, and confirmed where the Japanese were assembling. Then they pulled back and fed the battalion the one detail commanders crave in thick terrain where the enemy actually is. The battalion used that information to swing a maneuver element into a blocking position while another element applied pressure. When the Japanese tried to fall back the way they came, they ran into Marines already sitting on the line. That's when the eventual kill totals began to make sense, not as a headline, but as a chain reaction. Hit leaders early and units fragment. Fragmented units in dense terrain don't retreat cleanly, they dissolve into pockets. Pockets get isolated. Isolated groups move along predictable routes. Those routes can be closed. Close enough doors. And the enemy isn't retreating anymore, he's trapped in geography he can't see. By the end of the first phase, the Marines weren't winning because they'd discovered a superweapon. They were winning because they were no longer blind. Whaling's hunter teams had done three things the normal rifle line struggled to do in that environment. First, they made the enemy reveal movement instead of accepting surprise. Second, they attacked control points leaders, observers, machine gun crews, so Japanese units lost coherence fast. Third, they delivered intelligence precise enough for the battalion to maneuver with purpose instead of guesswork. You could feel the shift in the way Marines moved. Not bravado clarity. Weeks of hating every yard of jungle had taught them what a bad contact felt like. Now, for the first time in a long time, contacts were being shaped before the main line paid the price. But Guadalcanal never lets you enjoy momentum for long. The Japanese were still out there in strength. And once they understood what was happening, once they realized the Marines were hunting their leaders and gunners first, they adjusted. They tightened movement, changed routes, tried to bait the scouts into firing and exposing positions, laid small ambushes meant to catch the hunters. That meant the next phase wouldn't be more of the same. It would be the enemy trying to solve Whaling's solution, while the Marines tried to finish the job before exhaustion. Counter-moves, and the jungle itself pulled the advantage back into the trees. By the second day, the Japanese weren't confused anymore. They were careful, and they were hunting back. Phase 1 had shown them that something had changed on the American side of the jungle. Marines were no longer blundering forward into close-range traps. Someone was shaping the ground ahead of the rifle line, removing key men before a firefight even started, turning Japanese concealment into a liability. So the Japanese tightened their intervals, shifted off obvious trails, and began sending small feelers forward not to win a fight, but to draw a shot, locate a hide, and collapse on it. This was the moment Whaling's entire experiment could have died in a single afternoon, because a scout sniper team survives on invisibility, and once the enemy starts treating the jungle like a chessboard, every mistake becomes fatal. Whaling's answer was not to trade aggression for aggression, but to double down on discipline. Don't pay for bait. Don't shoot at cheap targets that exist only to make you reveal yourself. Wait for the nervous system leaders. Observers, the machine gun element that makes a pocket dangerous, then move immediately after the shot. In theory, that sounds simple. On Guadalcanal, it was punishing, because patience had a physical cost. Men were operating on broken sleep, living wet, eating thin, fighting malaria and fatigue, and still being asked to lie motionless for hours while insects crawled into cuffs and sweat pooled under helmet liners. A man doesn't get careless because he wants to. He gets careless because his body is begging him to shift, to scratch, to breathe louder than the jungle will forgive. Phase 2 became a contest of endurance as much as marksmanship. And the Japanese tried to exploit exactly that forcing time. Forcing discomfort. Forcing a nervous trigger pull. As Japanese units began to fall back, they didn't retreat in straight lines. They dissolved into the trees and reformed in small pockets. And each pocket was a potential machine gun, a handful of riflemen with good concealment, a trap that could stall a platoon until another pocket slipped away and set up again. To a conventional battalion in that terrain. This is how you get bled dry, no clear front, no clean target, just a series of close-range contacts where the jungle punishes every attempt to move. Whaling's teams attacked that problem by thinking less about clearing jungle and more about closing doors. A pocket is dangerous only if it has options routes to slip away, folds in ground to hide in, crossings and ridgelines that let it reposition before the main marine effort can tighten the noose. So the scouts stopped chasing every shadow and started identifying the routes the enemy had to use to survive shallow river bends, narrow spines, natural lanes where the vegetation thinned just enough for movement, and small pieces of high ground that controlled the next 100 yards. Then they positioned themselves not to fire immediately, but to observe and control. The goal was to make Japanese movement predictable. Predictable movement could be contained. Containment could be turned into encirclement. That is how the big number begins to sound less like a headline and more like the output of a system. A scout team would establish a hide along a likely route and wait, sometimes for hours, until a small Japanese group tried to move through. When it happened, they didn't shoot to win a firefight. They shot to lock the enemy in place. The first and last man would go down, not for drama, but for mechanics. Men in the middle freeze because they can't tell if the threat is 1 shooter or 10. They can't run forward without stepping into fire. They can't run back without stepping over bodies. They go to ground and become their own pocket. Then the battalion's maneuver elements tightened in from the sides and rear, and a retreat that might have turned into another day of skirmishing became a trap with shrinking walls. Other times the scouts didn't fire at all. They simply reported numbers, direction, pace enough detail for the battalion to reposition and cut a route before the Japanese even realized they were being steered. In that jungle, information was combat power. The team that could tell you where the enemy was and where he was going could win without exposing itself to needless shooting. The Japanese responded with aggression once they understood what was happening. Small assault groups began sweeping likely hide areas, using rifles and bayonets, firing into brush lines that looked too still, trying to flush Marines out of positions the way you flush a snake out of grass. They used noise, sudden bursts, and probing movement to force a quick shot, because a quick shot in the jungle is usually a bad shot, and a bad shot is a signature. In one of those moments, a whaling team nearly got erased. They had chosen a hide with a clean view over a shallow approach, and it was a strong position if the enemy walked into it. It was a weak position if the enemy came from the side. And that's what happened. Japanese troops slid through a secondary route and appeared on the team's flank at close range, the kind of distance where a firefight becomes a coin toss and the loser doesn't get to crawl away. The team leader had seconds to decide. If they opened fire immediately, they might kill 1 or 2, but they would be pinned and overrun. If they held, they might be stepped on. He chose movement first sideways into the thickest vegetation, accepting scratches, noise, and the risk of separation, because separation was still better than being fixed in place. For a short stretch it became the purest kind of jungle terror, hearing boots and breathing. Seeing shapes between leaves, refusing to fire because firing would be admitting where you were. The team slid, vanished, reappeared at a new angle, and only then fired again. Not at the nearest man, but at the one controlling the sweep, the one pausing to signal and look back. When that man dropped, the sweep lost shape for just long enough. 2 Japanese surged forward, another hesitated, a fourth turned the wrong way, and the Marines slipped out of the trap they had almost walked into. The incident mattered because it showed the weakness and strength of Whaling's plan. In the same breath, hunter teams could be flushed and destroyed if they became predictable. But if they maintained disciplined movement, target selection, and refusal to take bait, they could survive even when the enemy tried to reverse the hunt. As Phase 2 continued, the battalion-level effect became visible in the way Japanese resistance changed, instead of coherent movement and deliberate ambushes along favored lanes. Japanese groups were being forced into smaller, less connected pockets. Leaders disappeared early. Machine gun positions were identified before they could establish a rhythm. Attempts to mass movement were broken up before they could build momentum. The Japanese weren't simply losing men, they were losing options. And in terrain like that, options are life. Each closed route made the next movement more desperate. Each desperate movement became more predictable. And predictable movement, under observation, was the one thing Whaling's method punished relentlessly. The sequence repeated until the Japanese strength west of the Matanikau was not only reduced, but geographically trapped scouts locate and shape. The battalion maneuvers with purpose. Enemy units fragment into pockets. Routes are closed. Pockets are reduced over and over until the jungle stopped being a shield and started being a cage. When the shooting finally eased, the Marine side didn't treat it like a victory parade. Guadalcanal didn't allow that kind of mood. It was assessment. Quick and practical what worked, why it worked, and what could be copied next time. The most important takeaway wasn't that snipers killed people. Every infantryman already understood that. It was that concentrating scouting and precision fire into a forward element changed the battalion's efficiency. It reduced blind movement and pointless contact. It turned Japanese concealment against them by forcing the enemy to move under observation or not move at all. Just as importantly, it changed how Marine leaders thought about talent. Marksmanship and fieldcraft stopped being personal traits hidden inside rifle squads and started looking like a capability you could build, organize, and deploy like a weapon system in the immediate aftermath. Whaling's crazy plan wasn't a curiosity anymore. It had produced results on the most dangerous flank of the island, and it had given commanders a method they could repeat: select the right men, train them for the environment, push them forward, and let them shape the fight before the main body commits. It didn't end Guadalcanal, but at a moment when the margin for error was thin. It helped keep the perimeter intact, and it gave Whaling proof on the only scoreboard that mattered that being difficult and being wrong were not the same thing. When the Matanikau fighting cooled and the perimeter around Henderson Field held, Whaling's experiment didn't get filed away as an odd Guadalcanal story. It lingered because it solved a problem the jungle kept creating. Guadalcanal wasn't unique in its brutality, but it was honest. It punished distributed skill and rewarded concentrated capability. What Whaling had done, pulling the right men, training them for a specific environment, and pushing them forward as a deliberate tool, was a reminder that American ingenuity in war isn't always hardware. Sometimes it's organizational. Sometimes it's recognizing that talent scattered evenly across a formation can be wasted, and that the same talent, organized with intent, becomes a force multiplier. That lesson outlived October 1942 because every infantry unit that fought later in the Pacific ran into the same constraints: short visibility, sudden contact, hidden weapons that stopped movement cold, and every commander who read Guadalcanal's reports understood what a battalion gains when it can see first. The second lesson was psychological, and it's easy to miss if you focus only on body counts. Scouts and snipers aren't just precision shooters. In dense terrain, they are a pressure system. When leaders and machine gun crews start dropping without warning, an enemy unit doesn't simply lose men, it loses confidence in the ground it's standing on. It stops moving the way it wants to move. It starts bunching, hesitating, second-guessing routes that looked safe 5 minutes earlier. In other words, it becomes predictable, and predictability is death in jungle fighting. Whaling's teams didn't need to annihilate every Japanese position by themselves. Their real impact was ripping out the enemy's ability to coordinate, then feeding the battalion enough clarity to close doors, tighten pockets, and finish the fight on favorable terms. The third lesson is the one most by-the-book organizations learn only after the battlefield forces them to. A field idea that sounds crazy on day 1 can become doctrine by day 10 if it produces repeatable results. Whaling's detachment was off-book when it started, and it carried real risk taking the best men out of depleted companies, pushing them forward into the most dangerous space, trusting them to operate with restraint and discipline while everyone else relied on them for information. But the outcome demonstrated something larger than one colonel's reputation. It demonstrated that specialized reconnaissance and precision engagement, properly selected, trained, and integrated, could reshape how Marines fought over time. Those wartime lessons fed into the Marine Corps' long-term pride in small, aggressive reconnaissance elements and dedicated scout sniper capability, not as lone wolf legends, but as teams that extend a unit's eyes, reduce blind contact, and make the enemy feel watched even when no one is visible. And that's why this Guadalcanal story still matters. Not because a headline number is satisfying, though 750 in 4 days is hard to forget, but because it shows how warfare often turns on decisions that look unsentimental and unglamorous in the moment: who you select, how you train, where you place them, and what you demand of their discipline. Whaling didn't change the jungle. He changed how Marines moved through it. If this story stayed with you, do me a quick favor and hit the like button. Every like tells YouTube this kind of history still matters, and it helps this story reach the next person who would have never heard Whaling's name. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want more World War II stories like this: real people, real decisions, and the moments the textbooks rush past. And before you go, leave a comment so we know you were here. If military service is part of your family story, share whatever you're comfortable sharing: who served, what branch, or even just that it's personal to you. You're not just watching. You're helping keep these names from fading out. Thanks for being here, and thanks for making sure the men who fought in places like Guadalcanal don't disappear into silence.